There is a quiet frustration that many people carry but rarely speak about openly. It's the feeling of doing everything right, thinking positively, setting intentions, visualizing the life you want. And yet somehow, nothing truly shifts. You try to stay aligned, you repeat affirmations, you even begin to believe that something bigger is listening. But deep inside, there's a lingering doubt that whispers, "Why isn't this working for me?" That question is not a failure, it's a doorway. Because what blocks your manifestation is not always what you think. It's not a lack of effort, and it's not even a lack of belief in the traditional sense. The truth is far more subtle and far more transformative once you see it clearly. Most people are not blocked because they don't want their desires strongly enough. They are blocked because their internal state, the emotional and physiological identity they live in daily, is not coherent with what they are asking for. In other words, the mind may be reaching forward, but the body is still anchored in the past. And when that happens, no matter how powerful your intention seems, it gets filtered through a system that is still operating from old patterns, old fears, and old expectations. This is the invisible error that almost no one talks about in a practical, grounded way. It's not dramatic, it doesn't scream. It hides in subtle reactions, in unconscious habits, in the way you feel when nothing is happening yet. You might be asking for abundance, but still feeling tension around money. You might be visualizing love, but still bracing for disappointment. You might be declaring trust in the universe, but internally trying to control every outcome. And this is where everything begins to change. Because once you understand that manifestation is not just about what you think, but about who you are being at a deeper level, you stop chasing results and start observing your internal alignment. You begin to notice the small signals your body sends, the emotional patterns that repeat, the quiet ways you might still be resisting what you say you want. This is not about blaming yourself. It's about seeing clearly. In this journey, we are not going to talk about magic shortcuts or empty positivity. We are going to explore the space where neuroscience meets inner awareness, where emotional coherence becomes more important than forced belief, and where real transformation begins, not from trying harder, but from becoming internally consistent. Because your miracles are not being denied, they are being filtered. And once you learn how that filter works, you can finally stop blocking what has been trying to reach you all along. The identity behind the desire. What most people never realize is that manifestation does not begin with what you ask for, but with who you are when you ask. There is a subtle but powerful gap between desire and identity, and it is inside that gap that most intentions dissolve before they ever take form. You may consciously want a new reality, more abundance, deeper love, inner peace, but if your emotional identity is still organized around lack, protection, or past disappointment, the system resists what feels unfamiliar, not because it is wrong, but because it is unknown. The brain is not designed to seek what is best for you. It is designed to preserve what is familiar, and familiarity, for many, is built on years of emotional conditioning that were never consciously chosen. Moments of rejection, instability, loss, or even subtle forms of neglect leave traces that become internal references. Over time, these references solidify into a kind of emotional baseline, a silent agreement about how life works and what is possible. So when a new intention arises, something expansive, something different, it is not only evaluated by the conscious mind. It is filtered through this deeper layer that asks, quietly but persistently, is this safe? Is this consistent with who I have been? This is where the invisible resistance begins. It does not appear as doubt in the traditional sense. It appears as tension, as subtle hesitation, as an inability to fully relax into the idea of already having what you desire. You might visualize success, but feel pressure in your chest. You might affirm abundance, but sense a contraction in your body. These are not random sensations. They are signals that your identity has not yet reorganized around the new reality you are trying to create. And so, without realizing it, many people begin to amplify their effort. They try harder. They repeat more affirmations, extend their visualizations, consume more content searching for the missing piece. But effort, when it comes from misalignment, often reinforces the very state it is trying to escape. Because underneath the repetition, there is still a subtle emotional message. I need this to happen because something is not enough right now. And that message, more than any word or image, is what the system responds to. There is also a deeper layer that often goes unnoticed: the emotional loyalty to the past. Even when the past has been painful, it carries a strange sense of identity. It defines who you have been, how you have coped, how you have understood yourself in the world. Letting go of that identity is not always immediate or comfortable. It can feel like stepping into something undefined, where there are no guarantees and no familiar patterns to hold on to. And so, part of the system hesitates, not because it wants to suffer, but because it has learned to survive in a certain way. This hesitation creates a form of internal contradiction. On one level, there is a clear intention moving forward. On another, there is a quiet pull backward, maintaining the known emotional landscape. The result is a kind of energetic inconsistency, where signals are being sent in different directions at the same time. And in that inconsistency, manifestation loses coherence. Understanding this does not require force or self-criticism. It requires awareness, the ability to notice not only what you are thinking, but what you are feeling beneath the surface. To recognize that the body is not simply following the mind, it is carrying its own history, its own patterns, its own expectations. And until those patterns begin to shift, the external reality tends to reflect what is most stable internally, not what is most desired consciously. There is a quiet shift that begins when this becomes clear. Instead of asking only, "What do I want?" a deeper question emerges: who am I being while I want it? And within that question lies the beginning of real transformation, not as a performance, not as a forced belief, but as a gradual reorganization of identity, where the new no longer feels foreign, but familiar enough to be received. The silent tension behind control. There is a moment, often unnoticed, where a genuine desire slowly transforms into something else, something tighter, more urgent, almost restless in nature. At first it feels like motivation, like clarity, like purpose. But beneath that surface there begins to form a subtle tension, a quiet insistence that things must happen within a certain time, in a certain way, under certain conditions. And without realizing it, what once felt expansive starts to feel controlled. This shift is delicate, almost invisible, yet it changes everything. Because when desire becomes entangled with control, the internal state moves away from openness and into vigilance. The mind starts monitoring, analyzing, checking for signs, trying to interpret every delay, every silence, every unexpected turn. And in this state, manifestation is no longer a process of alignment. It becomes a process of surveillance. The nervous system plays a central role here. When there is an underlying sense of uncertainty or past disappointment, the brain becomes more sensitive to the absence of results. It interprets waiting not as a natural unfolding, but as a potential threat. This activates a subtle form of alertness, where the body remains on edge, even if the thoughts appear calm and optimistic. There is a hidden layer of anticipation that never fully relaxes. This is where the contradiction deepens. On the surface, there may be affirmations of trust, declarations of faith in the process, even moments of genuine hope. But underneath, there is a quiet question repeating itself. When will it happen? And that question carries more weight than it seems. Because it is not just a curiosity, it is often a reflection of doubt disguised as patience. Control, in this context, does not always look like force. It often appears as subtle insistence. It shows up in the need to feel reassured, in the habit of mentally revisiting the same desires, in the constant attempt to stay aligned through effort rather than through natural coherence. It creates a loop where the person feels responsible not only for their state, but for the timing of reality itself. And timing, when pressured, becomes distorted. The present moment is no longer experienced as sufficient. It becomes a waiting room for something better. Attention shifts away from what is actually happening and toward what is missing. Even positive visualization can become infused with a sense of lack if it is used as an escape from the current emotional state rather than as an extension of it. There is also a biochemical layer to this experience. The brain becomes conditioned to seek resolution, to close loops, to obtain confirmation. Each imagined future creates a spike of expectation, and each delay creates a subtle drop. Over time, this cycle can become addictive, not because of the outcome, but because of the anticipation itself. The person becomes attached not only to the result, but to the emotional rhythm of expecting it. In this state, the body rarely experiences true safety. It remains oriented toward what is not yet here, scanning for evidence, reacting to absence as if it were a signal of failure. And from this place, manifestation loses its fluidity. It becomes something to manage, to maintain, to protect from going wrong. Yet beneath all of this, there is often a deeper layer that goes unspoken, a quiet fear that if the desired reality does not arrive, something within will collapse, that the hope itself is fragile and must be guarded through constant attention. And so control becomes a form of protection, a way to stay connected to the possibility, even if it creates tension in the process. But tension, even when subtle, shapes perception. It colors interpretation, influences behavior, and most importantly, communicates a state of incompleteness. Not through words, but through sensation, through the inability to fully settle into the present without reaching forward. And it is here that a quiet realization begins to emerge, that the more the future is held tightly, the less space there is for it to arrive naturally. That control, even when well-intentioned, can become a barrier disguised as effort, and that perhaps the state from which a desire is held carries more influence than the desire itself. The emotional patterns that repeat reality. There is a layer of experience that operates beneath conscious intention, quietly shaping outcomes without ever announcing itself. It is not found in what is said during moments of clarity, nor in what is visualized during brief periods of focus. It lives in repetition, in the emotional habits that unfold throughout the day, in the automatic reactions that arise without permission, in the tone of inner dialogue that becomes so familiar it is no longer questioned. And it is within this layer that reality often finds its most stable blueprint. What is repeated emotionally tends to become expected, and what is expected, over time, begins to feel real even before it takes form externally. This is not because thoughts alone create reality in a simplistic way, but because emotional consistency trains the nervous system to recognize certain states as normal. When a state becomes normal, perception adjusts to confirm it. Attention filters information accordingly. Choices begin to align with it, often subtly and unconsciously. And gradually, life organizes itself around that internal pattern. This is why brief moments of elevated intention rarely override long-standing emotional habits. A few minutes of feeling aligned cannot easily replace hours of tension, self-criticism, or quiet dissatisfaction, not because the positive moments lack power, but because the system has been conditioned through repetition. The body, in particular, learns through frequency. It memorizes emotional states the same way it memorizes physical movements, through continuous exposure. There is also a quiet paradox here. Many people believe they are working toward change, but in subtle ways they continue to reinforce the very patterns they wish to transcend. A person may desire peace, yet repeatedly engage in internal conflict. They may seek abundance, yet maintain a constant awareness of limitation. They may long for connection, yet remain guarded, anticipating disappointment. These patterns are not always obvious. They are often woven into daily life in ways that feel justified, even logical. Over time, these emotional patterns become self-confirming, not because the world is rigid, but because perception narrows. The mind begins to notice what matches the internal state and overlook what does not. Opportunities may pass unnoticed or be dismissed before they are fully understood. Interactions may be interpreted through a lens shaped by past experiences rather than present reality. And in this way, the internal pattern quietly recreates itself through external confirmation. There is also a deeper psychological dimension that influences this process. Certain emotional states, even uncomfortable ones, can become part of identity. They provide a sense of continuity, a familiar narrative about who one is and how life unfolds. Letting go of these patterns is not always immediate, because it involves stepping outside of that narrative into something less defined. And the undefined, even when it holds potential, can feel uncertain. This creates a subtle resistance to change, not as a conscious refusal, but as an unconscious preference for what is known. Even when the known is limiting, it carries predictability, and predictability to the nervous system often translates into safety. So the system maintains the pattern, not because it desires stagnation, but because it has learned to associate repetition with stability. Within this dynamic, Manifestation is not blocked by a lack of desire, but by the consistency of an opposing state. The system responds to what is most practiced, not what is most wished for. And practice, in this sense, is not limited to intentional exercises. It includes every emotional response that is repeated, every internal reaction that is reinforced, every moment of identification with a familiar feeling. A quiet shift begins when this becomes visible, not as a judgment but as an observation, the recognition that what feels automatic has been learned, and what has been learned can, over time, be reorganized, not through force, but through awareness and consistency. And in that recognition, a different kind of possibility emerges, not as a sudden transformation, but as a gradual reconfiguration of what the system begins to accept as normal. Because when emotional patterns begin to change, even slightly, perception follows. And when perception shifts, reality no longer needs to be forced. It begins to unfold in ways that reflect the new internal landscape. The quiet reorganization of inner coherence. There is a point in this process where the focus gently shifts away from trying to change reality and begins to settle into something more subtle, yet far more powerful. The reorganization of inner coherence. This shift does not happen through force or intensity. It unfolds in the space where awareness becomes steady enough to notice what has long been automatic, not to correct it immediately, not to resist it, but to see it clearly without distortion. Inner coherence is not a fixed state. It is a dynamic alignment between thought, emotion, and physiological response. When these elements move in different directions, the system becomes fragmented. The mind may generate elevated ideas while the body holds tension. The emotions may fluctuate between hope and fear, creating a rhythm that never fully stabilizes. And within that instability, the signal that is sent outward becomes inconsistent. But when coherence begins to form, even in small moments, something changes. The body no longer reacts as quickly to imagined threats. The breath deepens without effort. Thoughts begin to slow, not because they are suppressed, but because they are no longer chasing resolution. There is a subtle sense of presence that replaces the constant anticipation of what comes next. And in that presence, the internal environment becomes more stable. This stability does not mean perfection. It does not imply the absence of doubt or the elimination of every uncomfortable emotion. Rather, it reflects a growing capacity to remain internally aligned even when external conditions are uncertain. The system begins to respond instead of react. And that distinction, though quiet, carries significant weight. As this alignment strengthens, the relationship with desire also changes. Desire is no longer held with urgency or tension. It becomes less about needing something to happen and more about allowing a possibility to exist without pressure. The emotional tone shifts from grasping to openness, from expectation to receptivity. And this shift, though subtle, alters the entire energetic landscape. There is also a recalibration of time. When coherence increases, the experience of waiting begins to soften. The future is no longer perceived as something that must arrive quickly in order to validate the present. Instead, the present moment gains a different kind of depth. It becomes less of a transition point and more of a space where something meaningful is already unfolding, even if it is not yet visible externally. This does not mean that outcomes lose importance. Rather, their importance is no longer tied to emotional survival. The system no longer depends on immediate confirmation to remain stable. And because of that, the internal state becomes less reactive to delay, less influenced by temporary absence, and more grounded in its own consistency. There is a biological dimension to this shift as well. When the nervous system begins to experience repeated moments of regulation, it starts to reinterpret what is safe. New emotional states, once unfamiliar, gradually become integrated. The body learns that it can exist without constant vigilance. And as that learning deepens, the baseline begins to change. This is not a dramatic transformation. It often goes unnoticed at first. It reveals itself in subtle ways, in the way certain thoughts no longer trigger the same intensity, in the way silence feels less uncomfortable, in the way the need to control begins to loosen without effort. These changes are not forced. They emerge as the system reorganizes itself around a new form of stability. Within this emerging coherence, Manifestation is no longer approached as something to achieve, but as something that reflects what has already shifted internally. The focus moves away from outcomes and toward alignment. And in that movement, a different kind of relationship with reality begins to take shape, one that is not built on pressure or urgency, but on consistency and presence. There is a quiet understanding that develops here, that what once felt distant may not have been withheld, but simply incompatible with the previous internal state. And as that state changes, even gradually, the sense of separation begins to dissolve, not through effort, but through alignment that no longer needs to prove itself. The closing realization: there comes a moment when everything that once felt confusing begins to reorganize into clarity, not because the external world suddenly changes, but because something inside you stops resisting what has always been quietly visible. The struggle was never truly about your desire being too small or your effort being insufficient. It was about the unseen patterns that shaped how you related to what you were asking for. What you have been seeking has not been absent. It has been filtered through layers of emotional memory, through a body that learned to expect delay, through a mind that tried to control what it could not yet trust. And in that process, your intention, no matter how strong, was often diluted by inconsistency, by tension, by the subtle belief that something was still missing. But now, a different perspective begins to take form, one that does not require force or urgency or constant validation. A perspective where alignment becomes more important than effort, where emotional coherence becomes more powerful than repeated words, and where your internal state no longer contradicts what you desire. This is where the real shift happens, not in a single moment of breakthrough, but in the quiet decision to no longer live in contradiction with yourself, where the past stops defining your emotional baseline and the present becomes stable enough to hold something new. And in that space, manifestation is no longer something you chase. It becomes something that recognizes you. There is only one question left to consider. If nothing outside you needs to change first, what inside you are you still holding on to that no longer belongs to the reality you say you want? If this message resonated with you in a deeper way, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. There is more to uncover, more to understand, and more to integrate. And if you are ready to continue this journey, follow the next video on your screen. It was chosen to expand exactly what you are beginning to see now.